Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. The 2023 Giving Report by CanadaHelps begins with a stark headline. It's time for change. The report goes on to outline alarming challenges facing the nonprofit sector, including unprecedented demand for services, falling donations, staff mental health issues and burnout, and rising inflation. We've also seen reports of a disturbing decline in public trust in the nonprofit sector and a continued reckoning of nonprofits and charities to embrace diversity and inclusion from leadership to frontline workers. To help us understand the challenges and explore solutions, please welcome Cathy Mann. Cathy is an award-winning fundraising professional, teacher, author, and podcaster. Since 2007, as part of Fundraising Lab, Cathy has advised multi-level and community-based organizations working in social justice, with youth, in education, with Indigenous communities, and in healthcare. She led Toronto Metropolitan University's fundraising management program as academic coordinator for a decade and taught for 20 years. Welcome to the podcast, Cathy, and welcome to your dog.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, the CanadaHelps Giving Report, published this year, really painted a very stark picture of the challenges facing the sector right now, including an alarming drop in fundraising dollars at a time when service demands are increasing. What are you seeing with the organizations you work with? Is it in line with the CanadaHelps data from earlier this year?
Yeah, I mean, yes. We see lots of organizations that don't have fundraising fundamentals in place. And so when they start introducing good practices, we see improvements, right? So when they implement good data management practices and use their data well, we see improvements. And when they send out well-crafted solicitations, we tend to see a bump in their fundraising. And when they engage their boards and their volunteers in meaningful ways, we see improvements in fundraising. And when they practice good stewardship, we see that. And I'm not throwing my clients under the bus, but they're trying to do so much with so few resources that it's really difficult to do good fundraising. And so I love this quote by Brock Warner. He said, "We expect specialist expertise with generalist responsibilities." And I think what we're seeing now is as fundraising becomes more complex, it's difficult to do everything that's needed, especially in small fundraising shops where you might have a team of, well, sometimes zero, or one full-time person or a small team. You know, fundraising is this niche skill that's not really often understood by senior leadership. And, you know, executive directors are subject matter experts in their cause or their mission, but they might not have been really exposed to fundraising. And so I see organizations that underinvest in fundraising and expect outsized results. And I see organizations that don't really understand how to create an ecosystem that will allow fundraising to thrive. And I see organizations that don't proactively try to build a culture of philanthropy because they don't know how to, and they simply don't have time. So, you know, the kind of clients I work with I work with organizations that work in hunger and homelessness and community groups and the intersection between like LGBT communities and indigenous communities. They're notoriously underfunded and they're asked to address these wicked social problems. So those clients that I mentioned, hunger and homelessness and LGBT and indigenous, they saw an increase of donations during COVID because COVID shone a light on all of these social issues that became increasingly relevant during a pandemic. And like most things, once the media attention wanes, the focus on the issues wane. And so we're seeing that the increase in donations that were made during COVID have been dialed back. And so the clients that I work with did have a bump during COVID. And now they're trying to figure out how to go back to not only pre-COVID donation levels, but potentially a drop even beyond that because of all of the financial issues that we're facing in society right now.
Yeah, you talked about fundraising becoming increasingly complex. In what way is it increasingly complex? Maybe you could paint a picture for those of us who aren't in the fundraising space full time.
Sure. So, when I started fundraising 30 years ago, I was able to be a generalist in a small shop and do more or less everything. But 30 years ago, there wasn't social media. The complexity has increased. The social issues are still, sadly, largely the same, but there is a need for fundraisers to do more than what I did 10 and 20 years ago. And so not only are fundraisers being asked to, run the data, the database, which, like, data management has become increasingly complex. Social media has added a whole layer of complexity. It's added an opportunity, but it has also added a layer of complexity. So now, on top of, writing a direct marketing campaign, used to be it was a direct mail and you had a process that you had to follow, but now it's direct mail and incorporating email and incorporating social media. And there's so many more moving parts now to a typical fundraising program that, no one person can have all of the skills required to run a fundraising program. And many of the clients I work with, and many of the clients at Canada Helps, that are members of Canada Helps, many of them tend to be the smaller and medium-sized organizations. And so they're definitely the ones who are struggling as the world becomes more complex.
And in terms of individual donors, what demographic trends are we seeing? We've heard about how, obviously, boomers are exiting in a variety of different ways. What are the drops in donations coming from, and what does this suggest to you that we're in for in the near and further future?
Well, I don't have data to back this up, but when I look at my clients, I mentioned that they're experiencing these drops from their COVID level donations, while they're still trying to address these really wicked social issues. I suspect that's going to be even more dramatic this year because people are struggling, right, with food prices and gas and housing prices increasing at alarming rates. People just don't have the same amount of discretionary funding, so that is oftentimes donations are a place that families cut back. I did see an alarming trend during COVID that I spoke out against passionately, and I hope people will continue to heed my call now. I saw organizations that decided not to ask donors for money during COVID because they thought donors were struggling financially. And so those organizations made a decision not to ask for money. I very strongly made the case and still agree that donors have agency and can make their own decisions. We tend to be caregivers in our sector. And to me, it is the ultimate in thinking that we know better in the name of caregiving to not invite people to support a cause that they might care deeply about. So I know lots of people are struggling, and I'm not suggesting that your fundraising request can be like insensitive to the position that we find ourselves in, but donors have agency. And if our organizations are making the decision to not ask, well, we know that's going to impact fundraising. So, to be really clear, just like donors have agency, they can make their own decisions about whether or not to give to your organization or not. And I think if you represent an organization that serves some of the most vulnerable in our society, now is not the time to not reach out to your community for support.
Yeah, certainly. If you don't ask, you don't get, as we know. So, thanks for that really important observation. The Canada Helps Giving Report also calls on charities to create better relationships with young donors. Do you think the sector is doing a good job of engaging young people as donors? How could they improve?
Well, as someone with gray hair, I am still going to weigh in on this topic, and And I think some of my thoughts about this might be a bit contrarian. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to share them. First, I think that, engaging young people as donors is the luxury of larger fundraising shops. Small shops are working nonstop to just do the basics, and thinking about and executing a strategy to engage younger donors is simply beyond their capacity most of the time, when they're not doing the basics very well with their existing donors because they're doing so much and they're underfunded. So that's my first thing. Secondly, I think people grow into philanthropy when they have more money. So typically when you're younger, you have less money to give, so you're not engaged in philanthropy. So our focus on young people as donors is kind of missing the mark. We need to move beyond this transactional thinking about donors to thinking of people as supporters to our organizations or our causes. And what's the pathway where they can see themselves being engaged with the organization over time? So does it start with volunteering? I mean, oftentimes it does. We know from some of the work that Volunteer Canada is doing that the term volunteering doesn't even resonate with younger people anymore. So we need to think about what language we can use. We also know that young people care more about causes and less about institutions. So how does that impact how we engage younger people? What does that mean for participation with your organization? Like, what does a pathway look like? And are you thinking about a lifetime journey once people get involved with you? I used to work with a literacy organization, and we had thousands of university students as volunteers. And I reflect back on that and I think, okay, as the fundraiser, I was so busy trying to just raise money for the cause. And I was disconnected from the folks who did the volunteer work. So I didn't proactively have any kind of pathway from volunteer to engaging people more robustly down the road. So huge missed opportunity, but also no resources to do that internally. And so I think that's really one of the struggles, is that we're asking people to think strategically about how to engage young people, and everybody's just full out. And again, I will say it again, we're underfunded in our sector. So it's sort of speaks to, the disconnect between fundraising and other parts of organizations. Fundraising still operates in isolation somewhat. And, I see strategic planning for an organization operating in isolation, as strategic planning for fundraising. So how do we see people's engagement with the organization organically and throughout a lifetime, and not just as transactional, their volunteers or their fundraisers or donors?
Yeah, that's very interesting. When speaking with some volunteer management professionals, that's also what we're hearing from them is, how do you engage young people, but really, thinking much more organically about getting them engaged with the work in a variety of different ways, not just what we traditionally thought of as volunteering, but really helping them embrace social impact and thinking differently of what their activities are in relationship to a not-for-profit or charity.
And can I just say one thing, and vice versa? We have donors who we don't engage in as anything other than donors, and there's an opportunity for us to be engaging donors much more deeply in the organizations and the causes that we represent. And I think there's a big opportunity there for us too.
That's a really great point, for sure. And hopefully that creates a much stickier relationship with those people. Do you think there are any particular fundraising strategies that you're seeing working well right now? Are there any new trends that really are promising in terms of reversing some of the rather bleak trends that were highlighted in the Giving Report?
I'm sure there's really cool new strategies out there, but I think that too often we get excited about focusing on the shiny new object, and that continues to stretch organizations who maybe aren't doing the basics as well as they could be. So I think the trend that I want to see focus on is do the basics well, and get them well established. And then once you have that, you can start to think about how to incorporate the latest and greatest or the newest trend. Having said that, I think that this is both a trend and a basic at the same time. I really hope our sector will more and more get on the data bandwagon. There's so much opportunity to automate some of the work that we're doing if organizations use data functionality more robustly. And we see all the time that data is not something that the sector is necessarily using to its fullest. So if there was one thing, it's not the new shiny object, it's not AI, but it could be AI in terms of some of the data functionality that's out there. But if anybody was going to focus on anything, I would hope that it's data.
And you mentioned, organizations struggling to do the basics. I'm curious what you're seeing organizations wasting time and effort on, and what are the basics? I mean, for those of us that don't have your expertise, what are the basics?
Well, so what are the basics? I think that it depends on what, so every organization probably has a different set of strategies and tactics that they want to focus on depending on what their circumstances are. So being really clear about which fundraising strategies make sense for you, I think is an important component, and that's different for every organization. But again, I work with a lot of small and medium-sized organizations. If somebody's starting their fundraising journey, definitely invest in foundation grant writing, and then the strategies depend. So sometimes special events are a great strategy, and sometimes they're not a great strategy. So it really is having a bespoke fundraising plan for your organization. But beyond which strategies you use, the basics really do include infrastructure. So what are the systems and processes that you need to support fundraising? Because the fundraising, the asking for money is like the tip of the iceberg. And behind the scenes, it's all of the planning and support that goes in place. So the donor database, the making sure that your messaging is really clear by having like a foundational case statement so that you're talking about your work in a compelling and inspirational way. Making sure that you have policies in place that support the work that you're doing. These kinds of basic systems and processes, reporting, reconciling with finance. It's not the sexy stuff, but it's really important that that you get that done. And again, the data, super important. I'll say that data is not just the purview of small fundraising shops. Like I see bigger fundraising shops that also really struggle with data too.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about data because that came up in a conversation that I had with a number of subject matter experts in the tech space about AI, and that the real challenge with nonprofits in Canada is that you require the data in order to instruct and inform your artificial intelligence tool, whatever it might be. But that there's a really severe lack of data among nonprofits, especially small ones, that could impact the efficacy of some of these potential tools, especially for fundraising. Have you experienced that or witnessed it in the work that you've done with clients?
All the time. We do a lot of data management work with our clients, and so we're often helping clients like reconfigure their donation data, because we'll ask them if they have basic measurements in place, like, do you know what your attrition rate or your retention rate of donors is? And they oftentimes don't know that number. And so that is such a basic foundational key performance indicator that if you don't know what your retention rate is, how do you know if you should be spending more time just stewarding your donors and trying to increase your retention rate or acquiring new donors? So we see lots of organizations that spend a lot of time and energy acquiring new donors. And if they actually understood what their retention rate is, they might get a bigger return on investment simply by improving stewardship and trying to get donors to become loyal donors. So yeah, data is, I've always said that I think data is the most undervalued component of a fundraising program. And again, it's because it's somewhat of a niche skill, and fundraisers get hired because they're good grant writers, or they're really good at talking with people, and they may not have data management experience. So we see all the time databases that are set up by people who don't understand what they're trying to accomplish at the end of the process, and so they can't get any meaningful data to be able to allow them to analyze their performance and make decisions based on how they're doing.
And what role does senior management and board leaders play in terms of the organization's fundraising efforts? How can they best support their professional fundraisers or consultants who are supporting their small nonprofit? I'm curious, is it just about providing the expertise or the resources for them to be successful, or is it something much deeper?
Well, I can go on about this one for quite some time. For the sake of brevity, though, I want to say that, the leadership's most important role is to create an ecosystem, or what I like to call an enabling ecology, that will allow fundraising to succeed. And so, if people are interested, I've written an article about it. I don't know if I'm allowed to send people to a URL that will give them more information. So if you're interested, I've got this framework called the 4 Pillars of Fundraising. You can go to fundraisinglab.ca/4 pillars. 4 is spelled out, FOUR, not the number. And really the 4 pillars are, do we have the right strategies in place? So do we have the right fundraising strategies? Are we doing major gifts? Or are we doing foundation grant writing? Or are we doing direct marketing? Do we have the right systems and processes in place? So do we have our database management and good communications and those sorts of things? Now, those are kind of the responsibility of staff, and they're what I call the mechanics of fundraising. Where senior leadership can really make a difference is in what I call the heart and soul of philanthropy. So the culture and the values. And so, is there a culture of philanthropy? And we as fundraisers use that term a lot, but I don't hear many of us talking about how to actually make it happen. I'm increasingly doing work with a colleague who deeply understands complex adaptive systems and how to help bring change to systems. And we're spending time talking about how to use those frameworks for systems change to impact culture of philanthropy. And it's really cool. I'm looking forward to developing a framework for implementing systems change related to culture of philanthropy. But sorry, I'm just going to stumble here for a moment. For the sake of this answer, though, I think board members and EDs can make their own donation and take the time to understand what the fundraising program consists of. And then they can ask how they can participate. And then it's the responsibility of the fundraising team to make sure that they can engage their leaders really meaningfully. And I think so. Both have a responsibility. And to the fundraisers out there listening, don't worry if your whole board doesn't engage with fundraising. Just try to find 2 board members who can be your allies. Or champions, and work with them to introduce change slowly, because change takes time and it's often resisted. And one of the things, and so all of this has to rest on organizational values. So, I think that you want to make sure that your fundraising aligns with your organizational values. And as fundraisers, we don't spend enough time talking about this. And I actually think it's why many people, I hate to say this publicly, but many people feel kind of icky about fundraising, like somehow it's tainted and that they have to sell their soul to participate in fundraising. And I would say quite the contrary. You want to make sure that your fundraising aligns with your organizational values so that you feel really good about the kind of fundraising that you're doing. Now, that's all fine to say, but how do you change the heart and soul of an organization? And it requires institutional will. and a willingness to do some really difficult work. Because I would say that part of this change includes like exploring and being willing to examine some of your mental models, especially around money, because fundraising is about money, and money is a topic that many of us have an unexamined relationship with. And what I have seen when I have done this work with clients is that lots of us have really fraught relationships with money. And so asking people to examine their money mindset in relation to money and fundraising can be an emotional journey, and that's hard to do. So look, if it was easy, more organizations would have figured it out already. But the heart and soul of an organization and trying to shift that requires a lot of courageous exploration. And humans aren't always willing to go there. But for those of us who work in these causes that are trying to address some of society's most wicked problems, I think we owe it to the corner of the world that we're trying to change to engage in some of these courageous conversations and explorations.
That's such an interesting observation, because I've certainly noticed that in the nonprofit sector, there is this reluctance or discomfort of talking about money, thinking about money. Money is sort of a dirty word, or it's not, I guess, morally elevated enough, or it's a challenge for some people to actually address this, as though it's, fundraising is like being a salesperson or something. And I guess in some respects it has similar. A good salesperson would probably make a pretty good fundraiser as well. It's about engaging interest and engaging with another human being and getting them excited about something. I'm curious what advice you have for individual fundraisers who, given the circumstances, might be in this economy, might be struggling right now.
Yeah, I just want to comment on one thing you said about fundraising and sales. And I think that the sales, it tends to be, salespeople will have disagreed with me on this, but it tends to be a bit, it can be transactional. And so we want to make sure that we're really looking at relational things. And I would say your comment about folks in the sector having a difficult relationship with money, I think it depends on which subsector of the larger charitable sector you're a part of. So if you are in kind of the world of social change, and those that, like many of my clients, have experienced scarcity all the time. They're notoriously underfunded, and when you exist in a world of scarcity, it's difficult to believe that money can be, let alone abundant. I don't use the term abundance. I talk about, is there a sufficient amount of money? But that notion of the challenges or the mistrust of money, I think, does often stem from living in scarcity. And there's all kinds of research that demonstrates how scarcity impacts a person for all kinds of things: money, time, whatever the scarcity issue is. So I it's a pretty complex topic, and I don't want to give it short shrift, but I think that our sector is so broad, and the big organizations are raising 60 or 70%, like 1% of charities are raising 60 or 70% of the dollars, and the balance, I would say, exist in varying degrees of scarcity. So I just wanted to say that, and now I've forgotten what your question was.
Just about any advice that you might have for individual fundraisers who might be finding it much more of a struggle this year, given all of the scenario of our economic strife and inflation and potential recession, all these sort of scary things happening financially. Any advice for them?
Yeah, I think my biggest advice is to not operate in isolation. So, if you are part of a small fundraising team, either a solo fundraiser or a 2 to 5 person team in a big organization, it's really easy to feel like you're operating in isolation, and your non-fundraising peers don't understand fundraising. That has been my experience. I've over more than 30 years of being in the sector. And so it's really important to reach out to other fundraising colleagues and um, commiserate. To be quite honest, like there is something so comforting and reassuring to be able to talk with other folks and see if they're experiencing some of the similar things. And I do think that the isolation that comes with being a fundraiser makes it all the more important to reach out to other fundraisers. And that's either create your own network, go to conferences, join online courses where you can interact with other fundraisers and talk about both your challenges and your successes in this environment. If you can talk about successes in this environment, I mean, that's heartening for yourself, but also I think gives hope to others who are in the sector.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about fundraising as an isolating profession, but it makes sense when you explain it that way. I'd love to know what you think when you look ahead, where you think fundraising is going in the next 5 years. Do you think there's an entirely new approach for fundraising is needed, or what do you see around the corner?
So I am heartened to see some of the challenges to fundraising, to traditional fundraising. I'm heartened to see, the movement, community-centered fundraising. There are some issues and some nuances I'd love to see in community-centered fundraising, but I'm just so happy to see that somebody is challenging how things have always been done. I've done some really interesting work with some Indigenous groups where they're really applying Indigenous values to philanthropy and shifting entirely how the relationship with donors is going to look. So I think there are some opportunities for us to learn from different communities. Fundraising has been really the purview. It's been pretty white. It's been pretty established. And I think it's time for fundraising, like so much of the rest of the world, to be paying attention to different voices. And I think the interesting both opportunity and challenge is how do we incorporate these different values um, and talk to donors and engage donors differently, because donors have become accustomed to operating in this kind of linear relationship that we have with donors. So fundraising, the model has always been, if you give us this investment, we'll make this change. So you give us this much money and you're going to house X number of homeless people every night. In terms of the social change work that philanthropy can be supporting, and that's really the kind of clients that I work with, the conversation with donors has to be far more complex. And you can't, there's no longer a linear relationship when you're in complexity. So if you're trying to address wicked social issues, you have to have a more nuanced conversation with donors. And the opportunity and the challenge is, how do we work with donors so that they're not expecting this predetermined outcome for their investment? So how do you say, well, we have this wicked social problem and there are a whole host of ways that we could address it. We're not sure which one's going to be the most effective. We don't know what all the variables are that are going to impact that. And we hope that you'll come along on this journey with us and give us general operating support so that we can explore and experiment with the things that emerge as we're working on it. And that's a very different kind of conversation to have with a donor than if you give us this much money, we're going to deliver this outcome. This notion of predetermined outcomes is just not something that you can guarantee in a world of complexity and in the kind of social change work that so many groups are trying to do.
Well, thank you, Cathy, for your insight into the world of fundraising, something that is a fascinating, but to many of us, obscure area of the not-for-profit sector, but so terribly, terribly important. So your insight and wisdom is very appreciated by the nonprofit sector professionals in our audience. So thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.